here's my sense. And mind you, I at least am consistent in this way over my lifetime. We've had parallels to this situation, and my advice would have been similar even to people across the aisle. But my sense is that what has already unfolded with Trump and the Trump administration in the context of this election means that ultimately he will not be seated as president, even if there is some fraud in the election. And I haven't seen compelling evidence of that yet, but it's of course possible, that the sequence of events that would result in him staying would look like an intense battle over balloting, in which we are very unlikely to get to the truth, but as in 2000 we could get to a win that would award votes, right? It could end up in the Supreme Court, which of course is a fraught venue at this moment anyway because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. And so the fact is, even in Trump fantasy world, him remaining in office is at such spectacular cost to the nation in terms of our already distrusting and at each other's throats nature, that my argument would be, look, Trump did not do a good job in the run-up to the election. In fact, he did an appalling job seeding the idea that the election was going to be stolen. That compromises him dramatically with respect to claims that it has been stolen.
I feel like you mean that he actually did a really good job of seeding that idea, which was a dishonorable thing to be doing.
Yeah, it was a dishonorable thing to be doing, and he did it effectively, which means that now his claiming that the election has been stolen is in the context that he set in motion.
Yeah, he's in Boy Who Cried Wolf territory. On the other hand, if there's actually a wolf, then you're the only one who's seeing it, right? Like, so there's you can do a both sides of this analysis story here.
You can, but I guess my point would be this. Look, I believe that presidents should be patriotic, and this should be so much a prerequisite for the job that we should never have had one that wasn't. I don't think that's where we are. I think that the game that gets you there is actually not very consistent with patriotism, because in effect, patriotism requires self-sacrifice is built into it, right? That it is the core of patriotism is self-sacrifice, and ruthless political self-promotion is the opposite. But in this case, the point is, look, the well-being of the nation does depend on a peaceful transition. And as our friend Ryan pointed out in a discussion this morning, the concession speech is actually a vital piece of this process, that the fact of the winner and the loser agreeing on what has happened and then events unfolding downstream of that, even though that's not technically what happens. Technically, the ballots get counted, official, calls are made. Those official calls result in the Electoral College doing what it does formally.
Which doesn't happen for weeks anyway.
Right. But the point is, the most important part of the process may be the winner and the loser converge on an interpretation of what has happened, and that kicks the narrative into the next mode, and we go forward. And so the point is...
And grace in concession both demonstrates your patriotism and allows for the country to come back together. And I actually saw George Bush's, of all people, his concession speech in 1992, and this was no fan of that guy at all. He was voted in '88 in the first election that we were ever able to vote in, and yet he gives a concession speech at the point that Clinton beats him that is terrific. It's short. It could be that he doesn't mean it, but he appears to mean it, and it is gracious. And he says, we're going to work with the new administration during transition to make sure that we have that we basically empower them with everything that they can be empowered with so that they help make this country as strong and productive and all of this as possible.
And that's the key thing. I don't know if there must be a term for it, but it's like the political equivalent of good sportsmanship.
Yeah.
And it is so vital to the functioning of the nation that I believe this ought to be the focus right now. And so I guess my point to Trump, which I assume he doesn't listen to the podcast, but if he does, what I would like him to think about is, let's say that you won an improbable series of victories in courts that then resulted in the Supreme Court delivering a verdict that caused you to be inaugurated in January. You would be inaugurated in a country that was so bitterly divided over what had happened that it would be diminished in its power spectacularly, and you would be governing in that environment, which is just simply not good for the country. So my argument is that the patriotic thing to do is to realize this was a very close election, that effectively makes it something like a coin flip. So in some weird sense, the winds didn't blow his direction, and that graciously accepting that result and stepping aside in an honorable way is actually both in the interest of the nation and also in the interest of his legacy and the judgment that history will render on him. And so, that's what leadership looks like, and I hope he will show it in this case.
I'm not sure I agree. I think maybe we should talk about this next time. That sounds completely right, unless it really was stolen.
Well, so, remember, my point is, at some level, stolen is not the right description for what big tech did in the context of this election. But I think we already know that this was not a free and fair election in the way that the founders viewed it. This was an election on a slanted playing field.
Fair enough. Okay, so put aside any question of ballot tampering and all of this. Slanted playing field in a toss-up. Of course, the coin came down the way the people who had slanted the playing field wanted it to.
Yeah.
It is both, not in keeping with apparently who he is as a person, but it's not clear that it would honor the half of the people who voted almost for him to step out of the fight either. And I'm not saying that the country can afford an extended fight. And it certainly wouldn't be good for him to be literally dragged out on January 21st or whatever inauguration day is, which would of course happen, just like just like in Portland, if the police and others had been allowed to do their jobs, they could have shut this shit down.
Yep.
Trump is not going to inhabit the White House beyond inauguration day. If Biden's the winner, it's just not going to happen. But for how long is it appropriate? Is it patriotic? And I don't think of him as a patriot. I don't think he is a patriot. But presumably many of the 70 million-ish people who voted for him are. And what about their voices if there really were shenanigans here that we deserve to know about?
Well, look, I don't disagree. I'm a big believer in the democratic control mechanism of our republic. And, the fact that it's so corrupted is part of what animates me, as you know.
Yeah.
My sense is that this cannot be settled here, will not be settled here. And if it were settled here, let's put it this way. It's either settled here in a direction that goes against him, and that doesn't change anything about the representation of the people that you're referring to, or it gets settled in his direction, in which case the damage that is done in this process is so spectacular in a context where we can least afford it, right? We're in a fragile condition rather than an anti-fragile one. So anyway.
The obvious analogy being to the 2000 election, And, many of us were grievously disappointed by the Supreme Court's decision that tossed that to Bush too, rather than to Gore. It's impossible to know what kind of an effective or ineffective president he would have been absent 9/11 happening so soon upon his inauguration. But it's also true that as much as he was easy to dismiss for most of us on the left as an effective statesman, he was not divisive in anything like the way that Trump is divisive.
We thought he was divisive at the time,
Well,
but now
sure.
we've seen
Sure we
much
did.
better example of that.
But it would, the dismissals were about things like, wow, he would prefer to be clearing brush on his ranch,
Yep.
as opposed to actually leading the free world.
All right. So then I guess my position is this, and I have not refreshed my memory on what happened at the end of the 2000 election, but my recollection is there was absolutely an honorable way to continue counting, and this was artificially stopped, which seated Bush and would have seated Gore had the counting continued. And so
I believe that's right.
My point would be that the sausage making involved in presidential balloting and elections has already stolen an election for one side. It's not like that's a new phenomenon. And my point, I think some people will have seen my tweet where I pointed out that Unity had behind the scenes been trying to create a prize that would have incentivized the rapid creation of a secure and what's the word? I can't remember the word when an auditable balloting mechanism in the form of an app. So the point is, look, this was a perfectly predictable catastrophe, right? We saw this coming. And let me tell you what happened. When Unity tried to get this thing jump-started, the idea was you can never adopt a new technology for standardizing the way that we vote because so many municipalities and states are involved in this process independently, and there's no way to herd all those cats in the same direction. And so our thought was, if we incentivize the construction of the app that accomplishes the goal, then at the point that the catastrophe predictably unfolds, the point will be, there is a solution, and it looks like this. And the problem is there wasn't enough enthusiasm because it wouldn't have been ready in time to save us from this one, which then means that we will be in this same situation down the road. Yep. And so, okay, we've got a couple of elections in which something has happened that should have been avoided by a modern and coordinated way of dealing with the ballots, and it's now time for us to do that. Short
Absolutely.
of that,
it's just, it's not, it doesn't grab the imagination because it's not sexy, right? It's not a tech fix to deal with nefarious political maneuvers. The only thing sexy in that sentence is nefarious, right?
Well, I disagree with you. I actually think it is kind of sexy, right? There is like an example. I think, is it Estonia that has done this? There is an example of some place you don't expect who has actually gone fully modern in this regard and solved the problem.
Okay.
But
now, if it is Estonia, I don't know. Does Estonia have a population that's like that of, I don't know, Georgia?
Right.
For instance?
It's tiny.
The state?
But the point is,
I have no idea.
It's doable. Now, there's argument about that. There are lots of sophisticated people who say you can't do this, and the reason is because you will create a nightmare. There is no system you could build that would make the problem better, because if somebody hacked into the system, this, that, and the other. Now, our belief in Unity looking at this is that there are solutions to this problem, but you have to be very broad-minded to see what the real problems are and figure out how you fix them in such a way that that A, a hack is very unlikely, B, that if it happened, that you would detect it and be able to reverse engineer what had actually happened. That is possible. But in any case, we should certainly be having that discussion broadly, because boy, did we see this exact moment coming, and let me tell you, it's coming again.